A very good evening to one and all present here. In today's, this is the lecture 4 for ecosystem. In the last lecture, we learned about different types of ecological pyramids, and we talk about the pyramid of number, pyramid of biomass, and how these pyramids are different from each other and what information does these pyramids tell us. So we get to know that pyramid of energy is always an upright pyramid. It can never be inverted, while pyramid of number and pyramid of biomass in certain cases can also be inverted, where the organisms that are present at the trophic level, at the first trophic level, that is the producers, are that where the organisms are low in number, while the organisms that are present at higher trophic levels are more in number. So, giving the pyramid an inverted shape, it, in comparison to an upright pyramid, where the number of organisms or the uh, broad base is represented by the organisms of the first trophic level, that is the plants, and the apex is represented by the organisms at the higher trophic levels. So this was about the different ecological pyramids. These different ecological pyramids gives us the information about uh, how in an ecosystem, how many number of organisms are present at each trophic level, or what is the amount of biomass that is present at each trophic level in a particular ecosystem, or how an energy flow in an trophic in an ecosystem in between the different trophic levels. Besides this, we also learn about the process of succession. So in succession, we get to know that it can be a primary succession or a secondary succession. So the primary is the one which takes place in the area where there was no pre-existing species. Therefore, it takes a larger time as compared to the secondary succession, where the species were already present there, but due to some natural disaster maybe, or due to some circumstances like volcanic eruption or flood maybe, these species were then blown away, and therefore uh, the succession then starts as a new. So therefore there's a different series of succession that starts, but this time, since already there are some already pre-existing species, therefore the process of succession does not take as long as it takes in the primary succession. So this was about the primary succession. And in today's lecture, we will learn about different biogeochemical cycles that occur in the nature. So let's start with biogeochemical cycles. Let me introduce what are biogeochemical cycles. So although we know that most ecosystems receive an abundant supply of solar energy, chemical and the solar energy may be unlimited, but the chemical elements that are available in any ecosystem are present only in the limited amount. And life on the earth, therefore, depends on the recycling of these essential chemical elements. As these elements are present in the limited amount, therefore, these elements need to be recycled. And therefore, the recycling of these essential elements is very important for the survival of individuals on the earth. Much of an organism's chemical stock is replaced continuously as nutrients are assimilated and waste products is released. So this is how most of the organism's chemical stock is replaced on the continuous basis. Whatever we eat, nutrients are assimilated in our body and we release the waste products. These waste products are then degraded by the decomposers, as we know, in the decomposition, by the process of decomposition, which then further release the inorganic nutrients into the soil. These inorganic nutrients are then further taken up by the plants and the cycle goes on. So when the organism dies, the atom in its complex molecule are returned in simpler compounds to the atmosphere, water, or soil by the action of decomposers. So it may be a leaf that has fallen from the plant, or it may be the waste products of plants and animals, or it may be some dead plants, animals, or human bodies. So whenever an organism dies, the atom in its complex molecules are released into the environment, into the atmosphere, water or soil by the process of decomposition, where the decomposers act on those materials, and by the enzymatic actions, these complex molecules are degraded into the simpler compounds and are returned back into the environment. So therefore, we can say that decomposition replenishes the pool of inorganic nutrients that plants and other autotrophs use to build the organic matter. Now, because nutrient cycle involves both biotic and abiotic components, these cycles are known as biogeochemical cycles. So biogeochemical cycles are basically the nutrient cycles, and since they involve both biotic and abiotic components, we have given them as the name as biogeochemical cycle, since it involves biotic components as well as the abiotic components. So this slide itself tells us the importance of the importance of the nutrient cycles, because we know that these elements or these nutrients are limited in nature, and therefore it is very important to recycle them so that uh, we can have a continuous stock of these nutrients, and therefore the survival become possible on the earth. And this recycling is mostly handled by the process of decomposition, by the action of decomposers. So therefore, decomposers play an important role in the replenishing the nutrients into the environment. So what is a geochemical cycle? So as I mentioned that the nutrient cycle involving both biotic and abiotic components are known as biogeochemical cycles. An element-specific route through a biogeochemical cycle depends on the element and the trophic structure of the ecosystem. So biogeochemical cycle differs from the element because what route it will follow for the recycling is depends upon the type of the element and the trophic structure of the ecosystem, that how many trophic levels are present in the ecosystem, what organisms are present at each trophic level in that ecosystem, defines the specific route through which the element will get replenished. For convenience, however, we can recognize two general categories of biogeochemical cycle. The one is global and the other is local. So the gaseous forms of carbon, oxygen, sulfur and nitrogen occur in the atmosphere, and cycle of these elements are essentially global. Global means all over like all over. Local means in a particular area. So the gaseous forms of carbon, oxygen, sulfur and nitrogen, since these are the gaseous forms that occur in the atmosphere, and therefore the cycle of these elements are essentially global. For example, some of the carbon and oxygen atom a plant acquires from the air as carbon dioxide may have been released into the atmosphere by the respiration of an organism in a distant locus. So therefore, especially the gaseous forms of nutrient recycling is a global form of biogeochemical cycle. So it involves the carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, sulfur and nitrogen. And as an example, we can understand that a plant which is present in my area may be like it acquires the carbon and oxygen atom, and may have and the CO2 that it has released into the atmosphere by the process of, like, for example, the carbon and oxygen atoms of atoms a plant acquires from the air as CO2 may have been released into the atmosphere by my respiration, let's say. So therefore, the plant will be present at a distant location from me, and therefore, these cycles are usually operate at a global level. Other elements, for example, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium are too heavy to occur as gases, and therefore they are usually transported in the form of dust. So in terrestrial ecosystems, these elements cycle more locally, as it is very difficult for these elements to travel such a far distance. These elements therefore cycle more locally, absorbed from the soil by plant roots, and eventually return to the soil in the same local environment by the decomposers. And in aquatic ecosystem, however, these cycle more broadly as dissolved forms carried in currents. So in terrestrial ecosystem, they usually gets collected or eventually returned to the soil by the decomposers. But if I talk about the aquatic ecosystem, so these nutrients are mostly present in the dissolved form in the aquatic environment, in the aquatic ecosystem, and are carried by the water currents. So therefore, since these nutrients are really heavy, they cannot be present in the form of gas. These nutrients are usually present on the surface of the earth, and they are usually transported in the form of dust. And especially if I talk about the terrestrial ecosystem, these nutrients are absorbed in the soil or returned into the soil by the decomposers. And in aquatic ecosystem, these nutrients are carried in the dissolved form as in the current, water current. So we will talk about the nutrient cycle of some of these elements in details. But before talking about the nutrient cycle of these elements in detail, let's have a brief overview of the general model of nutrient cycle. So what is a nutrient cycle, and what are different reservoirs, how nutrients get recycled, what is the role of different processes in a nutrient cycle. So we will have first a brief discussion about this. So a general model of nutrient cycling includes the main reservoir of elements and the process that transfers the elements between these reservoirs. So for example, in this figure, we can see that the process is represented on the arrows, and these are 4 different types of reservoirs that will be present. So each reservoir, let's say for example, reservoir A is defined by the 2 characteristics. First is whether it contains the organic or inorganic materials, and whether or not the materials are directly available for use by the organisms. So therefore, in every reservoir, the materials that will be present may be organic or inorganic. And the second point of the description, or the second characteristic of each reservoir, is that whether these materials are easily available or directly available for the use of organisms or not, or some other processes are required for their availability. For example, if I talk about reservoir A, so organic material is available as nutrients, and it is available for living organisms and detritus. Reservoir B, for example, have organic material. So organic materials unavailable as nutrients in reservoir B. Reservoir B is mostly fossils, and therefore it is not directly available for the use of organisms. So therefore each reservoir is defined by these following characteristics. The next is the nutrients in the living organisms and in detritus, for example, reservoir A, are available to other organisms when consumers feed and when detritivores consume non-living organic matter. Some living organic material move to the fossilized organic reservoir B, long ago by the process of fossilization, and was converted into the peat, coal, or oil. Nutrients in these deposits generally cannot be assimilated directly, as I mentioned. So this reservoir generally in reservoir B, where by the process of fossilization, long time ago, living organic materials that have moved to the fossilized organic reservoir, which are now converted to coal, oil, or peat, or we can say simply fossil fuels by the process of fossilization. So these nutrients now get deposited there, but these nutrients cannot be directly assimilated by the organisms. So this is the characteristic of reservoir D, where the organic materials are present, but these organic materials cannot be assimilated directly. The next is inorganic materials, elements or compounds. So burning of these fossil fuels release the inorganic materials that may be available as nutrients. So inorganic materials, elements and compounds that are dissolved in water or present in soil or air, that is reservoir C, are available for use. Organisms assimilate materials from these reservoirs directly and return chemicals to it through the relatively rapid process of cellular respiration, excretion, and decomposition. So, if the reservoir C has the inorganic materials that are available in the form of nutrients, organisms can directly assimilate these nutrients and may rapidly return back these nutrients into the reservoir by the process of cellular respiration, excretion, and decomposition. Although most organisms cannot directly tap into the organic elements tied up in the rocks, for example, reservoir D, these nutrients may slowly become available by the process of weathering or erosion. So the weathering or erosion of rocks lead to the release of minerals in the soil, in the form of soil, and therefore these nutrients which were initially unavailable in the form of rocks by the process of weathering or erosion is now available for the organisms to be used. Similarly, unavailable organic materials move into the available reservoir of inorganic nutrients when fossil fuels are burned, releasing exhaust into the atmosphere. So, these inorganic nutrients, we can say, can be assimilated in the can be assimilated or by the process of photosynthesis is utilized by the plants, where the plants may utilize these nutrients and be converted into the organic form. These organic form can further be eaten up by the living organisms and can be returned back into the reservoir C by the process of respiration, decomposition, or excretion. So this is how the flow of nutrients takes place between the reservoir A and reservoir C. So the flow of nutrients between the reservoir A and reservoir C is quite rapid as compared to the reservoir B and D. So a reservoir B is usually the reservoir of organic materials that contains the organic material in the form of fossils, especially like peat, coal, and oil. And these fossils released nutrients only on the burning. So burning of these fossils release nutrients into the reservoir C, makes nutrients available for the living organisms. While the reservoir D, which is a reservoir of inorganic materials that are not available directly for the organisms, but will be available when the process of weathering or erosion happens. And the weathering or erosion makes these inorganic nutrients available to the different organisms that can be taken up by different organisms and can be assimilated by. So this was about the nutrient cycle. One of the so this is a general model of nutrient cycling, and we will learn about each of these, like some of these nutrient cycles in details. So before proceeding to the nutrient cycle, I would also like to describe the water cycle. We have learned water cycle from very early in our life. Like we are studying water cycle from earlier classes also. So what is the biological importance of water? Water is essential to all living organisms. We know that our body is made up of 70% of water. Even the earth is surrounded by 70% of water. Earth is actually covered with 70% of water. So water is essential to all living organisms, and its availability influences the rates of ecosystem process, particularly primary production and decomposition in terrestrial ecosystem. So we know that humidity increases the rate of decomposition, or the availability of water increases the rate of decomposition. Also, we know that the productivity at the by the primary producers is a lot affected by the availability of water. Therefore, The water is a very important component and it is essential for the survival of all living organisms. Now, what are the different forms of water that are available to the life? So, liquid water is the primary physical phase in which water is used. Though some organisms can harvest water vapor, freezing of soil water can limit water availability to terrestrial plants. So, these are the different forms in which the water may be available: liquid, vapor, or freeze forms. The liquid water is the main primary physical phase in which the water is mostly used. Although there are some organisms that may harvest the water vapor, and if the water is freezed, it can limit the water availability to the terrestrial plants, as terrestrial plants or the roots of the terrestrial plants cannot take the freezed water. Therefore, the freezing of soil water can limit its availability to the terrestrial plants. So, the reservoirs for the water cycle is, as we know, the ocean contains 97% of the water in the biosphere. Approximately 2% is bound in glaciers and polar ice caps, and the remaining 1% is in lakes, rivers, and groundwater with a negligible amount in the atmosphere. So, the main reservoirs are the water bodies. The main process driving the water cycle are evaporation of liquid by solar energy. So the water in the water bodies is evaporated by the process of evaporation when the solar energy is present. So by the solar energy, the process of evaporation happens and the water gets evaporated. Next is a process of condensation where the condensation of water vapor into the clouds happen. So movement over, so basically the evaporation happens and there is a condensation. Then transpiration by terrestrial plants is one of the important process that moves a large volume of water into the atmosphere. So the process like transpiration, evaporation leads to the uh, movement of the large amount of water into the atmosphere. But after the formation of the cloud by the process of condensation, the process of precipitation happens that leads to the rainfall. So the surface and groundwater flow can return water to the oceans, completing the water cycle. So the water that was evaporated from the ocean and undergoes condensation leads to the cloud formation. By the process of precipitation, the water is then due to the rainfall, the water reaches the soil surface. Then percolation through the soil or runoff and groundwater again leads to the replenishing of water into the oceans, thus completing the complete water cycle. So this is what happens in a water cycle. So we know that water cycle is like, it's very basic and easy to understand. So three processes mainly happen: the evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Evaporation happens from the water bodies and the water gets condensed and leading to the formation of like what the condensation of water vapor into the clouds happen by the process of precipitation, or we can say rainfall, or precipitation may be any type of like can be in any form, like it may be a rainfall or a hailstorm, etc. So the precipitation over the land leads to the like returning back of water into the soil. The percolation of water through the soil or runoff and groundwater again leads to the replenishment of water into the oceans. So this was about the water cycle, and the next is the one of the important nutrients that is commonly required, which is the carbon cycle. So what is the biological importance of a carbon in our environment? So carbon forms a framework of the organic molecules that are essential to all the living organisms. We know that most of the sugars, like all the sugars, are composed of carbon molecules, and most of the organic molecules or the biomolecules are composed of the carbons, and therefore the carbon forms the basic framework of the organic molecules that are essential to the living organisms. So the carbon is in what forms the carbon is available to life. So we learn about these forms. So forms photosynthetic organisms utilize carbon dioxide during the process of photosynthesis and convert the carbon to organic forms, for example, glucose or sucrose that are used by the consumers, including animals, fungi, and heterotrophic protists and prokaryotes. So basically, the carbon dioxide is present. Most of the carbon is present, like the carbon is present in the form of carbon dioxide, which is utilized by the photosynthetic plants during the process of photosynthesis. So during the photosynthesis, in the presence of chlorophyll and water and sunlight, this carbon dioxide is then converted into the organic molecules or the organic forms that can be used by the consumers, including animals, fungi, and heterotrophic protists and prokaryotes. What are the major reservoirs of carbon cycle? So the major reservoirs of carbon include fossil fuels. We know that these fossil fuels are mostly the carbon, like heat, oil, or we can say coal is mostly carbon. And the other reservoirs are the soil, the sediments of aquatic ecosystem, ocean where the dissolved carbon compounds are present, plants and animal biomass, and the atmosphere where the carbon is present in the form of carbon dioxide. The largest reservoir, however, for the carbon cycle, for the carbon is the sedimentary rocks such as limestone. However, this pool turns over very slowly. So the release of the carbon or the deposition of carbon in this pool is very slow, but the largest reservoir of the carbon is are the sedimentary rocks. Now, what are the key process in the carbon cycle? So we know that the photosynthesis by the plants and phytoplanktons removes substantial amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide every year. So these phytoplanktons or the terrestrial plants use the carbon dioxide in which is present in the atmosphere by the process of photosynthesis, thereby producing organic compounds, organic molecules that can be used by the consumers. So these consumers then release the carbon in the either by the process of cellular respiration in the form of CO2 back into the atmosphere, or may undergo decomposition. So once these organisms die by the process of decomposition, most of the carbon is released back into the atmosphere. So the burning of fossil fuels and wood is adding significant amount of additional carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Over geological times, volcanoes are also a substantial source of carbon dioxide. So these are different sources of carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide which is present in the atmosphere is assimilated by the plants and the phytoplanktons in the process known as photosynthesis. This photosynthesis converts the carbon dioxide which is present in the atmosphere to the organic form that can be used by these consumers. So the consumers utilize these organic forms of carbon, and upon decomposition of these organisms, there is the release of carbon back into the atmosphere, and by the process of cellular respiration also carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. So this was about the carbon cycle, and we get to know that most of the carbon, like the largest reservoir is sedimentary rocks. However, the turnover is very slow. The next important element is the nitrogen cycle. We know that nitrogen is also present in various biomolecules like amino acids, proteins, nucleic acid, and is often a limiting plant nutrient. There are different forms of nitrogen that are available. So plants can assimilate their use to inorganic forms of nitrogen. So ammonium and like NH4 plus and nitrate NO3 minus. And so plants can assimilate or use inorganic forms as well as organic forms. So in inorganic forms of nitrogen, it utilizes ammonium and nitrate, while in case of organic forms, it utilizes amino acids. Various bacteria can use all of these three forms as well as nitrite. Animals can use only organic forms of nitrogen. Therefore, the conversion of these inorganic new forms of nitrogen like ammonium, nitrate or nitrite needs into the organic form is required to be used up by the animal. The main reservoir of nitrogen is atmosphere, which is, we know that it consists of around 80% free nitrogen gas. The other reservoirs of inorganic and organic nutrient compounds are soils and sediments of lakes, rivers and oceans, surface water and groundwater, and the biomass of the living organism. So what is the key process in the nitrogen cycle? Nitrogen cycle is really important and a process which is known as nitrogen fixation also happens. So certain bacteria fix nitrogen and thereby making it available for the plants and so on. So what are the different key processes? So the major pathway for the nitrogen to enter an ecosystem is via process which is known as nitrogen fixation. That is the process of conversion of nitrogen, that is N2, to forms that can be used to synthesize the organic nitrogen compounds. Now, certain bacteria which are known as nitrogen fixers as well as lightning can fix the nitrogen naturally. And nitrogen inputs from human activities now outpace natural inputs on the land. Two major contributors we know for the nitrogen are industrially produced fertilizers and the legume crops that fix the nitrogen bacteria in their food nodules. Other bacteria in the soil convert nitrogen to different forms. Some bacteria also carry out denitrification, that is the reduction of nitrate to the nitrogen gas, thereby releasing back the nitrogen into the atmosphere. Human activities also release large amount of reactive nitrogen gases such as nitrogen oxides to the atmosphere. So these are the different reservoir processes that may happen in a nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle may take place at the terrestrial level or in water also. So there may be an aquatic cycling and a terrestrial cycling. So the nitrogen in atmosphere is present. So it may be fixed by the bacteria or by the process of lightning into the nitrates. These nitrates are then taken up by the phytoplanktons, or the dissolved organic nitrogen may also be present into the water. And these phytoplanktons or the bacteria then convert the nitrogen into the form that can be utilized by the consumers, which upon decomposition and sedimentation again release the ammonium into the ammonium, which is a form of nitrogen, back into the oceans. Now, there are different processes that also takes place. For example, the nitrogen fertilizers, which are being used in the soil, or the industrial release of reactive nitrogen gases from the industries leads to the release of more nitrogen into the atmosphere. And the process of denitrification by certain bacteria where, as I mentioned, that the nitrates are reduced to the nitrogen, thus releasing back the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So this is the terrestrial cycling more in details, where the atmospheric nitrogen is fixed by the in the root nodules of the plants by the bacteria. These fixed nitrogen, here the process is ammonification, nitrification, where these bacteria converts the ammonia into ammonium ions. These ammonium ions then undergo nitrification by the bacteria, converting into nitrite. This nitrite is then converted into the nitrate, which is then assimilated by the plants. This is then the assimilated form of nitrogen is then used up by the plants, and these plants are then taken up by the consumers. So therefore, there is a transfer of nitrogen takes place here. Then by the process of decomposition, ammonium is again released back into the soil and can be again taken up by the plants. Or it may happen that the process of denitrification takes place where the nitrate is converted back into the atmospheric nitrogen, thereby releasing back the nitrogen into the atmosphere. So this is how the terrestrial cycling takes place. So the terrestrial cycling, especially the fixation of nitrogen in the root nodules of plants, is really important, and it involves two steps: ammonification, nitrification, and assimilation of these nitrates by the plants. So I again repeat these steps where in the process of ammonification, the formation of the ammonia is converted into the ammonium ion. This ammonium ion can be and then can, by the process of nitrification, can be converted into the nitrites. These nitrites can again be converted into the nitrates, or the ammonium can directly be used by these plants. The nitrates may be assimilated and can be used by the plants, or these plants may uptake the amino acids that also contain the nitrogen. So therefore, this is the process of nitrogen cycling, and nitrogen cycling takes place both in the aquatic environment. So there is an aquatic cycling of nitrogen by the phytoplanktons and the aquatic consumers, and there is a terrestrial cycling of nitrogen by the plants and the animals. So the next important cycle is a phosphorus cycle. This is one of the, this is phosphorus, as we know. So we mostly learn about carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. These three nutrients are important from the biological point of view also, because these three nutrients are present in abundance in the biomolecules. So the biological importance of phosphorus is that organisms acquire phosphorus as a major constituent of nucleic acids. It is also present in phospholipids and ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, and other energy storing molecules, and is available as mineral constituent of bones and teeth. So we know that our bones and teeth made up of calcium and phosphorus. So this phosphorus is really important, as it is present as a major constituent of nucleic acid, phospholipids, and ATP or other energy storing molecules, and is also present as a mineral constituent of both bones and teeth. Now, there are different forms of phosphorus that are available to life. The most biological important inorganic form of phosphorus is phosphate, which plants can absorb and use in the synthesis of organic compounds. Now, what are the reservoirs of the phosphorus cycle? So, the largest accumulation of phosphorus are in sedimentary rocks of marine origin. There are also large quantities of phosphorus in soil, in the oceans in dissolved form, and in organisms. Because soil particles bind to phosphate, the recycling of phosphorus therefore tends to be quite localized in ecosystem as compared to the nitrogen or carbon, which are gas, and therefore their cycling, as I mentioned, can be global. So the key process is, firstly, by the process of weathering of rocks, gradually adds the phosphate to the soil. Some leaches into the groundwater and surface water and may eventually reach the sea. Phosphate taken up by the producers and incorporated into the biological molecules may be eaten by the consumers. The phosphate is returned to soil or water by either decomposition of biomass or excretion by consumers. Because there are no significant phosphorus containing gases, only relatively small amount of phosphorus moves through the atmosphere, usually in the form of dust and sea spray. So this is a basic phosphorus cycle where if I start from the plants, let's say, so plants uptake the phosphate. These plants are then consumed by the consumers. Upon the decomposition of these plants and animals, these phosphate ions are again released into the soil, which can be taken up by the plants, or may, by the process of leaching, may leach into the water bodies. So these dissolved phosphate molecules are uptake of these dissolved molecules by the planktons, and this is a complete circle cycle where the uptake of phosphate takes place by the planktons. The decomposition of these planktons again release the phosphate into the atmosphere, into the water bodies. So these phosphate may undergo sedimentation also. Then by the process of geologic uplift or the wind-blown dust, these phosphates are released into the atmosphere. Although this is quite, the percentage of this process is quite less. So the weathering of rocks released, firstly the weathering of rocks released the phosphate into the water through the runoff the phosphate from the soil also comes to the water. So this is a simple basic cycle of the phosphorus, which is easy to understand. So rock minerals that are the reservoirs of phosphate by the process of weathering release the phosphate into the soil. This soil is then uptaken by the producers, which is then uptaken by the consumers and detritus. By the process of decomposition, release these phosphate back into the soil. This soil solution is then by the process of runoff or leaching leads to the release of the phosphate into the water bodies, and this released dissolved phosphate is then uptaken by the planktons, which further undergo decomposition, releasing back the dissolved phosphate into the water bodies. These dissolved phosphate may undergo sedimentation and may lead to the formation of sedimentary rocks. And this is how the phosphorus cycle takes place in the environment. So we learned about 4 different cycles. The first one was the water cycle. The second one was the second one was the carbon cycle. Third one was the nitrogen cycle, and fourth one was the phosphorus cycle. So in all of these cases, we see that these cycles have different reservoirs based on the type of the elements, and different forms of these elements are utilized by the plants and the animals. And so different forms of these elements are present in the environment that can be taken up by the plants and the animals, thus providing the helping in the recycling of these nutrients. So different processes, like as we see in case of decomposition, has been part of all these, almost of all these nutrient cycles, biological cycles, in case of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. But other processes, like for example, weathering in case of phosphate, allows the release of the unavailable phosphate molecules into the environment so that they can be made available to the producers, thereafter to the consumers. Similarly, by the process of nitrogen fixation, by the root, by the organisms, by the bacteria that are present in the, by the nitrogen fixers that are present in the root nodules of legume plants, the nitrogen present in the atmosphere is fixed by those organisms or the bacteria in different forms by the process of ammonification, leading to the formation of ammoniamine, then by the process of nitrification, converting this ammonium into the nitrite and nitrate ion that can be taken up by the plants. Also, similarly, in case of carbon cycle, there were process where this carbon is fixed. The carbon which is being fixed by the plants in the form of organic molecules is taken up by the consumers. These consumers release the CO2 back into the atmosphere by the processes like respiration or decomposition. So this was about the nutrient cycle of, and we talk about especially 3 nutrients that are important for the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. All of these 3 nutrients are are the major constituents of the biomolecules, be it amino acid, nucleic acid, or sugar. Therefore, it is very important for the survival of organisms on the earth to replenish these nutrients. And we also see the impact of human activities, how the human activities add up the different reservoirs, or the add up to the source of these nutrients into the uh, add up into the nutrient into these nutrient cycles. So we see that for example, in case of industries, we see that the setup of industries lead to the more release of carbon dioxide or more release of poisonous nitrogen gases into the atmosphere, thus increasing the source of these elements in the atmosphere and making their availability difficult to the consumers or the producers. Now, what are the basic differences between the carbon and phosphorus cycle? So, unlike carbon cycle, there is no respiratory release of phosphorus into the atmosphere. So, as I discussed earlier also and just mentioned that in case of carbon cycle, most of the carbon is released back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide by the process of respiration. But in case of phosphorus cycle, there is no such process that leads to the release of phosphorus back into the environment by the process of respiration. So there is no the respiration does not play any role in phosphorus cycle. The other two major and important differences between these two cycles are, firstly, the atmospheric input of phosphorus through rainfall are much smaller than carbon inputs. And secondly, gaseous exchange of phosphorus between the organism and environment is almost negligible. As we get to know that most of the phosphorus is either present in the dissolved form in water or may undergo sedimentation, which it forms rocks, then by the process of weathering or erosion, this phosphorus is again released back into the soil that can be taken up by the plants and can further be taken up by the consumers. So the gaseous exchange of phosphorus between the organisms and environment is almost negligible as compared to the carbon. The next, so we get to know the importance of these nutrients. Till now we learn about what is ecosystem, how an ecosystem function, what are the different properties of a particular ecosystem. So what are the different aspects of ecosystem we get to know about these. So before ending this ecosystem, the lecture on ecosystem, it is very important to know slightly about the ecosystem services. So the ecosystem, the structure of ecosystem, the concept of ecosystem tells us about how different organisms are dependent on each other. So it is really important to know that what are the different services these ecosystem offers to us. So healthy ecosystems are the base for a wide range of economic, environmental, and aesthetic goods and services. The products of ecosystem process are named as ecosystem services. This is important. This may be asked that what do we call the products of ecosystem processes? So the products that are obtained of the ecosystem processes are named as ecosystem services. For example, healthy forest ecosystem, we may not realize it, but the ecosystem is performing all these functions for us. So, for example, if I consider the healthy forest ecosystem, so these forest ecosystem purify the air and the water, mitigates droughts and the floods, cycle nutrients, generate fertile soils, provide wildlife habitat, maintain biodiversity, pollinate crops, provide storage sites for the carbon, and also provide aesthetic, cultural, and spiritual values. So we might not realize the importance of the ecosystem, but this example is enough to tell us that a particular ecosystem, for example, a forest ecosystem will perform or is actually providing us with so many services that it purifies the air and water, it mitigates the droughts and the flood, it cycles the nutrients, generate fertile soils, provide wildlife habitat, maintain biodiversity, helps in the pollination, it provides storage for the carbon and also provide aesthetic, cultural, and spiritual values. Though the value of such services of biodiversity is difficult to determine, it seems reasonable to think that biodiversity should carry a hefty price tag. So if I start giving the price tag to each of these services, obviously the bill would be quite large. So therefore, these services, the value of these services is difficult to determine, but we may think like it is reasonable to think that biodiversity should carry a hefty price tag. So one of the researchers have actually tried to give these the price tag. So Robert Constanza and his colleagues have actually tried to give the price tag to the services that the nature offer to us. So the researchers have actually put an average price tag of US dollar 33 trillion a year on these fundamental ecosystem services, which we generally taken as for granted. We do not consider the importance of plants. We do not consider the importance of, we actually ignore the importance of plants, ignore the importance of the biodiversity. But in actual or in reality, we start putting the price tag, as I mentioned, it will be a large bill. So researchers, for example, Robert Constanza has tried to put the price tag to these services, and what he found is that an average price tag of US dollar 33 trillion a year can be put on these fundamental ecosystem services, which are largely taken for granted because they are freely available to us. And this is nearly twice the value of the global gross national product GNP, which is US dollar 18 trillion. So it is almost twice the global gross national product value. Therefore, this makes us realize the importance of these ecosystem services. One of the out of these total cost of the various ecosystem services, the soil formation accounts for about 50%, and the contributions of other species like recreation and nutrient cycling are less than 10% each. The cost of climate regulation and habitat for wildlife is almost about 6%. So this was all about ecosystem and ecosystem services. With this, I would like to thank you all for attending this lecture series on ecosystem. So basically in this lecture series, we get to know what is the ecosystem, how the ecosystem functions, what are the different aspects of ecosystem, what is required for the maintenance of this ecosystem, how the nutrient cycling happens within an ecosystem so that then replenishment of these nutrients back, and these nutrients can be made available to the organisms again. So this is and also in the last we learn about ecosystem services, which is also very important to know that what we are considering as free is actually, if we start giving the price tag to that, it will be a very big amount. So thereby increasing the value, thereby emphasizing the value of the ecosystem and the need to maintain those ecosystems. With this, I would like to thank you all. Thanks for attending. In the next lecture series, we will learn about the biodiversity. Thank you.